So welcome everybody to our second of the series for 10 things veterinarians need to know about selling their practices. A few weeks ago, we did a talk mostly on selling to a corporate buyer. Tonight, we are going to be talking about selling to a private sale, to a private buyer. And they are very, very different animals, that's for sure. Definitely a different process. One is fast and speedy, and one of them is slow and
steady,
methodical. So I am Chris Rocchio. I'm a veterinarian, and I am a practice owner. I am the founder of Monarch Business Consulting, and we help veterinarians sell their practices, and we also help associate veterinarians buy into or buy practices.
Thanks, Chris. And I'm Peter Tonella. I'm an attorney at Mandelbaum Salzburg. We're a full-service law firm located in New Jersey. We have a national practice that's focused on veterinarians, and we help veterinarians buy and sell practices, associate buy-ins, and basically help them with all of their legal needs. But for tonight's purposes, what we'll be talking about is how we work with our clients in selling their practices.
So one of the most common things people ask us is, when do I start? And with a private sale, I think my answer is yesterday. You know, it's it's a long process, and the earlier you get started, the better. You know, whether it's just trying to get your financials in order or actually starting the process of looking for a buyer. You know, these things can take an extreme amount of time, especially if you don't have a buyer in mind. One of the big things with a private sale is we are at the mercy of the banks and financing, right? The buyer has to go out and get financing. And that really changes the information that we need to provide from your practice to a buyer. You know, in a corporate sale, they're going to be very focused on what's happening recently, what happened last year, what happened in the last 12 months. But with financing for a private sale, the banks really are interested in what's happened over the past 3 years. And so, you know, they want to know, is the practice declining? Is the practice growing? What is the exact profitability? Because the value of your practice and the ability for the buyer to finance your practice is going to be based on the profitability of the practice. And so we want you to start very early. We want you to start talking to us and possibly getting a valuation early, because we want to give you an idea of what is the value of your practice and what are the things you need to fix. By the time you call us and you're ready to sell, if we look at your financials and there's a major problems with the profitability, you know, we have to fix those going forward, and you might have to wait 2 or 3 years for your profitability to get to the point where your practice is at the value that you want. So obviously, the earlier you start, the better. And it is kind of good news, bad news. I mean, that's all the bad news. The good news is, with a private sale, when you do sell your practice finally, a lot of times you can leave, right? Because you're selling it to another veterinarian, and that veterinarian is going to replace you, hopefully, at the practice. Unlike where you have a corporate sale, the corporate, you know, buyer needs you to stay, and sometimes they're trying to get you to stay 3 to 5 years. You know, minimum 1 year, but you know, probably 2 years, and sometimes 3. You know, 3 to 5 if you're going to maximize your value. So the nice thing is, private party sale is a long process. It's hard to find a buyer, but when you do close, a lot of times you can, you know, maybe stay for a couple months, help with the transition, and then you're ready to retire. So that's the good news. But the bad news is, compared to a corporate sale, it's going to take you a lot longer. The other issue right now, and Peter and I were just discussing this before the video came on, is, you know, right now is probably the best financial environment to sell your practice. We have the lowest capital gains tax rates that we've ever had. They're already starting to talk about raising them. We think they may go up next year. We're not trying to make you panic, because at this point, it's a tough thing to get going right now and get your practice sold this year, but you next year may be just as good as this year. We know they're going to go up. We don't know when, and we can't predict that, but there is a great environment. Right now, interest rates are so low that the financing that the buyer is going to get with a very low interest rate is actually going to maximize the value of the practice, right? They can use the profit of your practice with a low interest loan and be able to, pay a higher value. And especially if now we can get loans that are not only 10 years, but they're 15 years sometimes, it really helps that buyer be able to buy your practice with no money down and actually have the value, the profit of the practice paid for the loan. So, again, when do I start? Now's the time. It's, they always say the first, when you should start thinking about selling your practice is the day you buy it. So, Peter, any comments on this besides
No,
probably your next subject,
right,
which is how long does it take? So
right,
that's why you
right.
got to start now.
Yeah, definitely. To your point, Chris, starting now, because even when, in the process to get ready to sell, and then when you go out and look for a buyer, that takes time, right? And then once you find your buyer, how long does it take to close that transaction? That's what we have over here. How long does it take? And as Chris mentioned earlier, when you're doing it, you're selling to corporate, it's a lot shorter time period, just because they have a mechanism in place in order to get the deal done. And you're typically not dealing with any financing behind the scenes like you are with, a private buyer. The 6 months, that's an average. If you're selling the practice along with selling the real estate, that 6 month time frame is pretty standard. Could be shorter. I actually have a transaction right now that I'm going to close, and I was looking at it before our call tonight. I'm going to close at the end of the month, and I looked when it first came in. It came in February 2nd, and we're going to close that on April 30th. That's an outlier. And the only reason we're closing that one in such a short period of time, and my client is actually buying the real estate and the practice. My client, as the buyer, he's done everything to really make it happen. He's gotten everything, he's so organized, gotten everything to his lender. He's worked so closely with the seller in order to move everything along. He's really taken it, and he's really driven this deal. And that doesn't always happen. He's not working. A lot of times the client is working all day long, and they don't have the time to focus as somebody like him who's not working. We talk about time. Now, Chris and I mentioned this in the last call. Time's not on your side. Once you find a buyer and somebody who's interested, you're a motivated seller. You have mentally prepared yourself. I'm going to sell. Have myself a buyer. As a seller, we always try to tell our clients, you want to move that transaction along. The longer more time takes between signing a letter of intent and the closing, only more issues can arise. So once you have somebody who's focused on your practice and you two are going to start talking about a transaction, you want to move that deal along. Talking about getting prepared, you're definitely going to be scrutinized by the buyer's professionals, their CPAs. The bank's going to be asking for information. It's almost like information overload. A lot of times when we're representing a seller, they get frustrated because either the buyer's asked for something too many times, their bank has asked for something too many times, their CPA. It just, the more organized you are, and working with somebody like Chris and his team who gets you ready to sell, it makes the process much more easier to move through. Then talked about a transition period. Chris hit on that. Most of the time, you're right. You don't have a longer transition period. There are times when they'll have the parties say, "I'd like for the seller to stay for a year." That's more of an outlier. It's usually a negotiation between the buyer and seller, and it's nowhere near the amount of time. If you're going to sell the corporate, where it's going to be a minimum one, most likely 2, 3, 4 years that you're going to be working for corporate. And then lastly, communication breakdown. we don't emphasize it. No, emphasize enough how important it is to communicate. Always about communication. When an issue comes up, you should be talking with your buyer and communicating. The more that the parties can communicate, and when we're in a transaction, we're working with Chris and his team, we're constantly talking. We're talking with our client or Chris's team is talking with the buyer or their representative. It's, issues come up, you try to address those issues as quickly as possible, communicate through them in order to keep the deal moving forward.
Yeah, I think, I was thinking about this today. Selling to a corporate buyer is like taking a Ferrari up the Northway of the Hudson Valley. It's kind of happens really fast, and your goal is not to do something stupid that is going to hurt you for a long period of time. Selling to a private party is like you and the buyer getting in a Volkswagen bus, and you're going to try to make it to California. It's a slow, frustrating process. You guys are it gets personal. You're stuck in this process together. You're going to yell at each other and get aggravated. And you probably could benefit from some sort of chemical medication during the trip. So, it's just, patience is what it is. With a private buyer, I tell all my clients, you got to be patient and you have to negotiate. You have to understand that the person on the other side doesn't know what they're doing. They've never done this before. A corporate buyer knows everything that's going on, and this associate vet has never seen numbers like this and documents, and it's a one-time thing. So you just have to be very patient.
Chris, there's two things to add to that, and it's funny. I'm trying to picture that in my mind. In one deal I'm working on right now, where my client's actually buying, you're talking to the buyer's attorney, and he's trying to get his client to sign documents. She's just not interested. It took my client driving to the next state where the practice is located, sitting down with her and saying, okay, we're doing this, right? We're going to sell, you're selling to me. It's like, yeah. It was almost, again, when you motivated seller, once you're ready to sell, moving it along. She won't return her attorney's phone calls. She's just not, you couldn't just get her over the goal line. We finally signed everything yesterday. He went down there and had her sign all the documents. So it's just, it's a process. And on the other thing too, and it's a deal that you and I, I'm working on with your team. The attorney actually went on vacation. Now, when you're dealing with corporate, there is no vacation. They got people working, around the clock. He took off for like 10 days. He said, I'm going to be unreachable for 10 days. And that's just kind of unheard of in a corporate deal, so you got to deal with professionals.
And like a lot of our clients, when they can talk after 8:50, 8:30 at night, because that's when they're home from work and that's when they put their kids to bed. And so, you're having meetings at 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, where a corporate buyer, they're available all day. It's their full-time job. So, it's definitely a whole different process. And again, our job is to keep everybody in the deal and keep them moving forward. And, the buyer wants to quit and the seller wants to quit, and everybody gets, upset and angry, and you just got to have patience, and you got to keep moving forward. That's the goal. Yep. So talking about selling your practice, how do you find a buyer? So, we have a pretty unique outlook on all this. So, the typical, how do you find a buyer used to be, you put the ads in journals and you hope somebody answers them, and it ends up being more like a real estate transaction. And we prefer to be very active with our clients when we're looking for a buyer with a practice we have for sale. One of the first thing, it's amazing how many people overlook asking their current associates whether they're interested in buying, because there's a lot of assumptions made. And, I can't tell you how many times we had a practice for sale, and the first thing we do is sit down with the associates and say, listen, Dr. Jones is selling her practice. She would love to sell it to you. If you don't buy it, she's going to sell it to somebody else. So, and we kind of lay out a whole cash flow proposal. And, so you really need to sit down with these associates, because the best thing for your practice is for somebody to work there that works there to buy it, because they already know the clinic and they know your clients and they know the culture. And the best thing for your associates, if they're going to buy a practice, is to buy the one they work at, right? They know everything about it. There's nothing hidden. They don't have to go in and try and figure out how the practice works. They already know it. So, we're very big on talking to your current associates and also your previous employees. We try to ask you who used to work at the practice, anybody that they have interest, have they bought practices, where do they work now? It's amazing how many practices we took over that, couldn't find a buyer in 3 years. And within a few weeks, we went out and talked to some of the people that used to work there. And one of them said, yeah, I always wanted to buy that practice, but I didn't think they were ever going to sell. Well, they're ready. Let's go. So, we really try to get our feet on the ground and go out. And again, the ads in the journals, what everybody thinks sells practices, I would say we sell maybe 5-10% of our practices through ads. Our other job is to go out in our business network, and you don't realize as a veterinarian how big that business network is. We talk to all the banks, we talk to lawyers like Peter and the lawyer network, we talk to the drug reps, we talk to some of the corporate buyers. Some of the corporate buyers meet associates out there that are looking for a practice, and and then the big thing is conferences, which again, when we talk about how long does it take you to sell your practice, this year is going to be tough. Last year was very tough because, normally we're giving lectures at conferences and meeting buyers and talking to associate vets, and, we've all been locked in our house. So, a lot of the conferences have either been canceled or they're virtual. I mean, look at tonight, we're giving a webinar. Normally we'd be talking in a restaurant,
Right.
with a free dinner, and you got 150 people in there because, you're serving dinner and drinks. So, it's definitely going to be a challenge with, the conferences being virtual and not really getting those, face-to-face meetings.
Chris, one point on the current associates, I've even found instances where the associate is upset. You find out the associate, the seller actually went to somebody else, never asked the associate that's in there or one of the associates. And then you find out, at some point in time during a transaction, the associate's really upset that the seller just overlooked them. They didn't even want to go talk to them for whatever. Again, communication. It was this poor communication. One where not even going to the associate and just saying, listen, I'm looking to sell. I'm going to go outside, and this is why I'm doing it, as opposed to looking to sell to you and the other associates in here. But it's kind of overlooks them completely, and it leaves a bad taste in their mouth.
Agreed. Yeah. Definitely. The next subject we're talking about is how to maximize the value of our practice. And again, with a private party especially, the value is determined by the profitability of their practice, because that cash flow, the extra cash that the practice generates, besides paying the rent to the owner of the real estate, even if it's the same person, and besides paying a salary to the veterinarian, there has to be extra money to pay for a loan, right? They need to borrow money. And even if you're going to provide the financing, which many times we don't recommend, they still need to pay the loan, whether or not the bank is holding it. But, the bank really is going to, look at closely the profitability of the practice and what that practice can support for a purchase price. And one of the big things, we talk about, again, when do I start? We run into a lot of practices where the owner is tired. The owner's ready to retire. They're beat. They're whooped. The pandemic and curbside is, tired us all out. But that's the last time that's the last situation you want to be in when you're selling your practice, because you need to continue that profitability through and during the sale process. When your practice is listed, we do all the work and we tell you, see clients, do surgery, work every day. You need to keep the profitability of that practice high, because even when we value your practice based on, say, 2020 financials, the bank is constantly asking, how was January? How was February? How was March? How was April? How is this year looking? And if you are tired and you're thinking of going from 5 days a week to 3 days a week, and the bank sees your practice, shrinking, it's a bad sign, and they're not going to want to finance a practice that's shrinking. So again, that's the way you maximize that value is, work like heck and hire somebody to deal with the sale. When I see vets trying to sell their own practice, it becomes a disaster because as they're focused on all the time it takes to sell their practice, their practice starts declining because they just can't keep, they can't work 5 days a week, 12 hours a day when, you're in a sale process dealing with the buyer who needs, this month's financials and all your insurance documents and everything. So, that's really in a private practice, that's the way you need to maximize. And again, get a valuation, get somebody in there to look at the financials and say, these are the things you need to fix. These are the places you can save money. We need to show some, profit in the next year or two so that we can maximize this. The other issue with financing, especially when you're looking at, bigger practices with corporate values attached to them, the gross income of the practice is going to limit the financing. So in other words, most banks are not going to finance more than the gross income of the practice. They have their own limits. Some banks are 80% of gross, some are 85. That was mostly in the pandemic. As the pandemic is ending, we're getting up into the 90 and 95%. But if you're looking for, 2 times your gross income to sell your practice, it's really not going to be able to be financed properly. There are some outlying banks that we work with that, can go above that, but it's definitely the exception to the rule.
Then once you get to the point where you have your buyer that's identified, then you talk about what's the transaction documents, and this is where we're working with together, with Chris and his team, kind of move the deal along. And the first document you typically have is your letter of intent. That's the offer letter that you as a seller is going to get from a buyer. Okay, and that offer letter is going to be non-binding, except there'll be typically a provision in that letter of intent that has an exclusivity provision. That's binding for a period of time. Maybe it's 30 days, 45, 90 days. It's between the parties that the seller can no longer solicit any offers or shop the practices around while that exclusivity period is in effect. Why is that? Because the buyer now is focused on you, and they've hired counsel. They have a CPA. They're getting their financing in place. They're starting to spend money on resources, so they don't want you, accepting other offers. But otherwise, the letter of intent is non-binding on either party, and either party can walk away. What's included in the letter of intent? It's a time for the parties to get settled on each other. You have the purchase price in there. You have all the assets that are going to be included in the sale. If there's any specific assets that may be excluded from the sale, that's identified in there. How long is the buyer's due diligence period going to be? And we'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of, if you're selling and there's a lease, usually that due diligence period is about 30 days. If you're selling and there's real estate and you're going to be selling the real estate, you'll see that due diligence period typically around 45 days, where the buyer needs more time to do some diligence on their real estate. Also, the letter of intent includes the restricted covenants. Typically, what's going to be included in terms of restricted covenants imposed against the seller. So then once you have the letter of intent signed, then it's given it to the attorneys to turn that letter of intent into a contract. And the contract that's typical between a buyer and seller is the asset purchase agreement. And what I put forth here, just so you have an idea, what are really the important terms that are in that purchase agreement? Obviously, purchase price. What's the purchase price? How is it going to be paid? Typically, it's all paid at closing in cash. How's that price going to be allocated? This kind of ties back into what Chris was talking about earlier. This is where the accountants from the buyer and seller spend some time with each other. If you're selling, you want to try to allocate as much as that purchase price towards goodwill, because you're going to pay capital gains tax on that. However, the buyer wants to allocate as much of that purchase price towards furniture, fixtures, and equipment, so they can depreciate that and get a write-off. But you, as a seller, you've already probably depreciated those assets, and anything that's allocated towards those assets, you're going to recapture and pay ordinary income tax on it. It sounds like a lot, but it's something that the accountants usually work on. And Chris, where do you see, in your experience, what's the average that in a private sale that you typically see that's shaking out that allocation?
I think the equipment is usually, we try to set a minimum for the inventory that is being sold, so that, especially on the buyer side, so that the seller isn't, using up all the inventory. So when the buyer walks in there, there's nothing in
Right.
there. So it's almost like the inventory is already allocated. So the usual negotiation is based on the equipment. And I would say, depending on the equipment, it runs anywhere from the $50,000 to $75,000 range to 150 to 200,000. Just depending on what's there. And it's always, like you said, the seller has it at 75, the buyer has it at 150. It's also important who pays the sales tax. So,
Right.
that can also have an influence. So if the buyer is selling the sale, paying the sales tax, they don't want to, increase the equipment too much because they have to pay 8% or whatever. So
Right.
it's always negotiated. It's always negotiated on the last day. It's
Yeah.
always, we've been doing this for 9 months, and now we're talking about how much equipment you have, and there's an argument where the bank's trying to close, and again, it's not $1 million one way or the other. It's
Right.
it's a tax allocation. So
I always try to tell a buyer when they, sometimes if a buyer or a buyer's accountant maybe digs in who's not familiar with doing this type of transaction, I said, you're going to have your time too at some point in time. I kind of lean towards the seller more.
Yeah.
Obviously, you want to be an advocate for your client, but you try to find some reasonable ground there in order, again, try to get the deal done for them.
And usually they both, goodwill and again, I'm not an accountant, so I don't want to comment deeply on this, but both goodwill and equipment get depreciated. It's just that the equipment can be depreciated, in 5 years, and the goodwill has to be depreciated, I believe, over 15. So
Yes. Right.
again, talk to your accountant about those details, but it's not, it's not a lot of money. It's
Right.
it's not worth breaking a deal over, which I've, almost come
Agreed.
to.
And some of the other important terms that you'll find in your purchase agreement, the seller's representation. So what are those? So you as a seller, you're going to be making, and this is an important part of the contract that the buyer's relying upon. You as a seller is going to be making representations to the buyer. You have, your company's in good standing. You have title to the assets, free and clear of any liens or encumbrances. The financial information that you've given to the buyer is true and accurate. The taxes have been paid. You've been operating the practice in the ordinary course, in compliance with law, and so on and so forth. And also the representations you're making as a seller in that contract, you're making, and most of you probably have an entity that is owns your assets as your practice. These representations are typically made not only by the entity, but you personally. So they got to be true and accurate because the seller is going to be relying upon them at the time of a closing. Contingencies in a deal with a private buyer, there's going to be a financing contingency. Okay, there's if there's there's going to be a lease contingency. If you're going to be there's going to be entering into a new lease if you own the real estate, you're not selling it, or there's going to be a contingency for acquiring the real estate. There's going to be the due diligence contingency. Like I said, it's either going to be 30, 45 days. It gives the buyer an opportunity to look at the practice, what contracts you have. They'll do judgment and lien searches. They want to make sure they understand what they're buying. They're not going to be assuming any unknown liabilities. There'll be time for a contingency, a lot of times for the buyer to enter into an employment agreement with your associates, or there'll be an assignment of the existing associate agreements to a buyer. Indemnification, without getting too complex about that, this is another material term you find in the contract. If we close today and you're a seller, and the buyer got sued 6 months from now for something that occurred while you own the practice, you would stand in front of that. You would be obligated to stand in front of that buyer and say, it wasn't their fault, it's mine. I'm going to indemnify you, buyer. And similarly, if you close today and you got sued 6 months from now, even though you sold your practice for something that happened while the buyer owned it, the buyer will be obligated to come in front of you and say, no, it's not their fault, it's mine. And then lastly, the restricted covenants. And we talked about term and radius. People always say, are they enforceable? Yes, they are, provided that they're reasonable. And a lot of times what we see here, Chris, I typically see anywhere on the short end from 3 years, 5 years is a very standard term for a restricted covenant for a seller. And then the radius just depends on the locale of your practice. If you're in New York City, there's going to be blocks to the east or blocks to the west. If you're in the suburbs, you can see anywhere from a low end of 10 miles. I've seen up to 15, 25 miles. It just depends on the practice. I don't know, did you want to add anything on the covenants, Chris?
Yeah, I would think two things. One is, you sold your practice, so you can't compete with it, and like we talked about, the allocation, mostly what you're selling is goodwill. You're selling a large component of the purchase price that the buyer is paying is for goodwill. And that goodwill is based on the fact that you're not going to compete with the practice you just sold to them. So, that's, I think, a very important thing. And I tell all my sellers, like, listen, just so you know, you're going to have to not compete with the practice you're selling. That's why you're getting the big paycheck. Right. And I think the other thing that veterinarians don't understand, they think of, non-competes, that they're not enforceable and all that. And that's can be true with an employment agreement, when you're just an employee. But when you sell your practice, right, Peter, that it becomes a different animal, because you really can't defend the fact that you're competing with a practice that you just sold to somebody and you're really destroying their, ability to make money.
Right. You got paid for that. Part of what the buyer is doing, he or she is buying you out of the marketplace. The consideration, that's what they're doing. So, in all the years I've been doing this, I've been doing it over 10 years now. I've never had an issue in this industry with somebody, setting up shop and looking to compete. I did in another industry in healthcare. We didn't represent that seller. He was represented by another attorney who came to us afterwards, but it was a short radius of 5 miles. And boy, as soon as he closed, he went right outside that 5 mile radius, and he was like in the shop, right? And he was soliciting his patients right back again. And it became an issue. And it really became a problem for our client. We represented the buyer at that point in time. Just two other points here. I put in here seller employment agreement, and we kind of touched on this already. Sometimes there's an employment agreement for a seller. Sometimes it's built right into the purchase agreement. It just depends on the deal, and it depends on the parties. And I'm sorry. Oh, I thought somebody.
I don't know what that was.
Yeah. And then the real estate, and you can flip to the next slide. The real estate contract. So what about the real estate? I kind of just want to flow into that. Are you selling the real estate? Do you own the real estate? Are you selling it to the buyer? Do you own the real estate and you're going to lease it to the buyer? Or you don't own the real estate and there's going to be a lease assignment? So it just depends on the deal. When there's a lease assignment or there's a lease, like I said earlier, the deals are a little shorter because there's not as much diligence that's needed in order to for the buyer to inspect the real estate. If there's going to be, if you don't own the property and you're currently leasing and there's going to be an assignment, that sometimes could delay the transaction because we're dealing with a third party. And a lot of times, the good thing is our client has a good relationship with the landlord, which helps. Again, that communication aspect. He or she's going to approach the landlord, say, listen, I'm looking to sell my practice to Pete. He's in the process of getting financing. And then the landlord and his accountant or his attorney is going to ask information from me as a buyer. So the landlord feels comfortable with the new tenant that he or she's going to have. I put in there personal guarantees and assignment. What is that? So most of the time, if there's a leasing situation, the buyer should expect to personally guarantee that obligation. If you are currently own your practice and you're leasing, most likely you're personally guaranteeing that lease. That when we represent a seller who has a lease, we try to get that seller released from that personal guarantee. So then the landlord is only looking at the buyer going forward after the closing. And then you always want the ability to assign that lease. And we've seen sometimes where that becomes an issue because the landlord maybe has a right to recapture the premises, or it's not a reasonable right to assign, and it's become an issue. I also put in here right of first refusal and purchase option. A lot of times in a lease, if let's say you own your property, you're gonna lease the property to the buyer. Maybe the buyer can't afford to buy your property right now, only the practice. A lot of times in that lease, there'll be a right of first refusal. So in the event you get an offer from a third party, you have to come back to your buyer and present them that offer. Also, there's a purchase option in there. You want to sell the real estate to the buyer just can't afford it. So you said, okay, buyer, when you're ready, you let me know. So in that lease, you'll have the right of first refusal, but in addition to that, you also have a purchase option. So when the buyer is ready, he or she can come to you and say, okay, I'm ready to buy the property. They're going to exercise their option. And at that point in time, we'll negotiate the purchase and sale of the real estate. If there's not a lease and you're going to sell your real estate to the buyer, it's usually a longer impact because it's about 45 days we typically see to do your inspection on the building. You're going to look at the roof, the HVAC, the structural components of the building. Typically, the bank, or no, we always recommend our buying clients to do a phase 1 environmental study. Those usually take about 30 days to get done from an environmental consultant. And provided that there's no issues, there's no underground storage tank that leak, there's no environmental issue with the property, then you can just move on. But if there's an issue arises from that inspection, then there's usually a phase 2 that gets done, and that could add some more time onto the deal. And then also you're doing a title search. So making sure there's no encumbrances, there's no encroachments from adjacent properties. Again, you have clear title to sell the property. Those are typically the components in the real estate sale. I don't know, Chris, did you want to add anything on that?
No, I think that's a good coverage. Obviously, the real estate is a whole nother opens up a whole nother can of worms. So, and it, like you said, with a real estate deal, it's going to delay. It just takes a lot longer to work through the issues. A practice sale can be relatively fast, but when you got real estate, there's a lot of things that need to be done and recorded, and they need to be done properly. So
most of our clients who are selling, most of them, and I don't know if Chris, you experienced this too. Most of them are selling the real estate too. That's just typically they go hand in hand. And here we're set up. We do all the transaction. A lot of times when we're working with a buyer, the one deal I'm doing right now, where my client's buying a practice in Virginia, we're doing the whole transaction. The buyer has an attorney to represent him on the seller has an attorney to represent him on the sale of the practice, and has a separate attorney for a real estate at a separate firm. And you can just see the communication there. Again, it's adding some time there between those two attorneys talking with each other. So again, talking about the time delays that can get impacted.
yeah, and we recommend when we're working with buyers, we recommend, obviously it's in their best interest if they can, to buy the real estate. There's no sense leasing the real estate and paying rent when you can own it and build equity in the real estate, because the real estate sometimes can be worth as much, or if not more, than the practice sometimes. So we're always gonna, if we're on the buy side, we're gonna try to recommend our buyers purchase the real estate.
And with the banks out there, the banks out there are aggressively financing these transactions. So, you're going to get, to this point here with the financing, you're going to get, the majority of that practice is financed, and then a good portion of that real estate is going to be financed. And here, a lot of times the banks are going to require some seller financing too. What is that? So you as a seller are expected to hold what's called a promissory note. So let's just say, maybe it could be 100,000, it could be 50,000. It's just, there's a certain percentage that the bank may require you as a seller to hold a note. So at the closing, you're getting cash from the buyer and a note saying, I owe you X amount of dollars and I'll pay you over a period of time. And a lot of times, Chris, what you see, a lot of times that note, the terms are very similar to what the buyer is getting from their lender. They almost mirror each other.
Yeah, the banks usually require those terms be similar to the bank note, which when you're holding 20% of a real estate loan and it's a 20-year note and you're 75 years old, you're not very excited about holding that 20-year note. But there are things you can do in wording you can use in there that the purchaser will attempt to refinance it in year 3 or year 5 or whatever.
Right.
But if you want a 10-year note for your real estate and the bank's going to put a 20-year note, it's not going to happen. We try to, again, with us in the deal and people like Peter who are used to these things, we tell our clients, like, listen, you can't fight this. There's not if they're going to finance it, and there's no bank that's going to come in second place to you. So
Right. And to your point, the second place, your note is subordinate. So, God forbid, and we haven't had this happen, and the buyer goes bust, you're subordinate, your note is subordinate to the bank's interest. But like Chris said, no bank's going to lend any money and take a secondary position to, a seller note. I also put in here just a comment of conventional financing versus SBA financing. Again, there's a lot of financing option out there for buyers. And sometimes, the buyer can't get the financing together for whatever reason. On a conventional side, they have an SBA solution for them. What we find, in terms of time, the SBA financing is a little more cumbersome. What's really the difference between the two? The SBA loan is partially guaranteed by the government. So sometimes the rates are a little longer. The term is longer. So it'll bring down maybe the payments, the overall payments. But it's a lot more expensive to get SBA financing as opposed to conventional financing from a bank. Most buyers will go to conventional first. They can't qualify or they can't get it. They go to the SBA financing as a secondary option.
Yeah, I definitely think the financing is always the biggest challenge in the deals, and they definitely takes the longest. You could be 6 months into a deal with a buyer and they still haven't secured financing. So you just have to be patient, and especially in the pandemic, it was tough at the banks, that's for sure.
Yes.
So our next subject is talking about a partnership. And when we're with a private party, we're talking about a partnership with either, one or multiple associates at your practice, or, an outside party that's kind of coming in. And I think a lot of people, when they think of selling their practice, they kind of look at it all or nothing. I'm going to wait until I'm ready to sell, excuse me, and then I'm going to go look for a buyer. Or, I'm going to work at this practice for 30 years and then, then I'm going to start thinking about selling. And we have been, we're really a big proponent of doing these early buy-ins where we're selling a small amount of equity to an associate doctor. We're also, a good way to attract associates from outside your practice. Everybody's looking for associates. That's probably the one thing I get every day. Oh, you do business consulting? Do you know any veterinarians that can work at my practice? I'm looking for them at my practice. If I knew any, I wouldn't be giving them to you. So, stand in line looking for associate veterinarians. So this is a real good way to have, associate veterinarians get some equity in your practice and kind of lock them in, one as an owner mentality, and also as a, excuse me, as a final purchaser for your practice. It's two ways you can do that, just what we call a straight buy-in, and that's you're offering them a small percentage, a minority interest in your practice, somewhere between 10 and obviously 49%. We're not looking to give them a majority ownership and run the practice. Of course, it happens when I'm talking, not when you're. But it has an open end, so we don't really know what's going to happen in the end. Is the is the associate going to buy the rest of the practice, or we're going to sell to somebody else, or have another partner come in, another associate, or we're going to sell to corporate and have that associate tag along in the sale to corporate. So that's what we call a straight buy-in. A buy-in, buy-out is kind of an agreement where we have the associate buy a small percentage now, say same thing, 20%, 30%, 40%, with a buyout planned for year 3 or year 5 or year 7, whatever the agreement is. But actually, we try to lay out the entire deal, the buy-in, and then the final buyout. And we can decide the price now. We obviously decide the price on the buy-in, but we might decide the price on the buyout. We might decide that it's going to be done later at a different valuation, or we just leave it open-ended and say, you're going to sell in 5 years, but we haven't determined what that price is. Going to be talked about later.
Right.
Some of the benefits for the owner is, you're selling some of your practice, but you're continuing to profit share. You haven't sold 100%. You're still part owner. You have control, mostly of what's going on, and you're, continuing to profit share from the equity that you own. The associate now has owner mentality. They're part owner. They feel empowered. They're now in control of what's happening. They're excited that at some point they're going to own the entire practice. So, they're going to help you grow the practice. They're going to help you manage the practice. They're going to help you with a long-term plan and really take some of that burden off your shoulders. And again, no better way to retain associates than to make them part owner of your practice. So nice thing is when the time comes, you have a well-defined exit strategy. You don't need to go out and look for a buyer. You already have one. You can enjoy the next 5 years and, be an owner, share your profits. And that profit sharing is going to pay the loan for that associate. So that associate really doesn't need to come up with any money. And that could be financed through a bank. We finance a lot of 20% buy-ins, or it can be an owner note where you're holding that note for 20%, and then in 5 years when the final buyout comes, the associate can go and get 100% financing for the final buyout.
Chris, you talked about the financing. I know that's like the last bullet on here, just jumping ahead. In your experience, when you had the seller and the financing, let's just say I'm going to buy 20%. I'm going to borrow $150,000, $200,000 from the bank to buy in. What are the discussions we have with our clients? What depending on which side we're on. If I'm representing a buyer, I'd say to the buyer, you got to speak to the seller about, the bank's going to require a lien on those assets, typically of the seller, which is, it's a little unorthodox in that manner. Say, well, geez, if the buyer defaults on a loan, the bank could foreclose on a loan, and it's not the collateral is really the seller is giving the collateral for that to happen.
True. Yeah, I mean that just needs to be explained to the seller ahead of time, so that everybody's aware.
Right.
And again, there's a lot of negotiating. So it sounds very simple, but I'm in one right now that's 6 months in, and we don't have a letter of intent. We're just
right.
I'm going to pick on Peter for 1 second. It's when we call Peter to get involved, we usually have a letter of intent, but we may have been working on this deal for 8 months before we call him. So
right.
Peter says it takes 6 months. He forgot about the 8 that happened.
Right.
Called him, so.
I know the deal's already teed up by that time. I know
exactly.
I know. And then what? This is a great outline of how it works, and then how does it actually happen? So you've talked about it. You've sat down with your associate. You're going to sell to her. She wants to buy in. She's excited. Then you have a purchase agreement. She'll get an attorney. You have an attorney. You negotiate the purchase agreement. What again? You're going to have the purchase price. It's very similar terms that you had in the agreement we talked about earlier, the asset purchase agreement. I always like to tell clients though, especially when representing a buyer, you guys are all doctors. You talk about DNA. A buyer is stepping into the DNA of that practice. So if there's any bad DNA in there, that buyer wants to know about it because it's going to stick onto them. So that's all set forth in the purchase agreement, and it's something that we work with buyer's counsel on to negotiate that terms of the purchase agreement. Also, you have the purchase agreement to sell that interest in the practice to your associate, right? Then you're going to have, when that associate becomes, a partner in the practice, you also need to have a partnership agreement. And Chris was talking about, sharing profits and whatnot. That's all spelled out in your partnership agreement. Sometimes people say a buy-sell agreement. So if you're an LLC, you're going to sell units to your associates. Then there's going to be an operating agreement between you and your associate. Who's responsible for day-to-day management of the practice? Usually that senior doctor is still. How were major decisions made? Are you going to give that associate an opportunity to participate in any decisions? Hiring an employee, borrowing money, entering into contracts over a certain dollar amount. That's all set forth in that partnership agreement. Also, in the event that something should happen to one of you while you guys are partners, somebody dies, somebody becomes totally disabled, somebody loses their license. That's all spelled out in the partnership agreement. That's your buy-sell provisions. The roadmap is already there for you two to separate if something should happen. And then sometimes as part of the purchase agreement, the partnership agreement, sometimes if it's not the employment terms, what are the employment terms of the doctors? Sometimes it's in a partnership agreement, or sometimes that they'll have separate employment agreements. And we already talked about the financing of the transaction and how that needs to be discussed up front.
I would say, my comments on this is that it is a great thing, and it really helps both sides. That said, it's a very complicated, negotiated, with a lot of moving parts. If you look at the owner, the owner right now is the owner. They're their own employee. They probably own the real estate, so they lease it from themselves. It's all done, there's just one person and they're the same, they're their employee, the owner, and everything. Well, now when you have a partner, you're now an employee of the new partnership. Your partnership now leases the building from the real estate owner, which is usually you. The new person is now an owner and an employee. And you have a relationship with each other. So I don't want to, minimize the complication of this buy-in, buyout, or even a buy-in. And you really need professional help. I mean, what we do, we kind of get in and negotiate. As a veterinarian, I kind of talk to both sides and negotiate with your associate and negotiate with you and go back and forth and try to get the bones all straightened out for the agreement. And then we go to Peter, and Peter draws up all the documents. The problem with trying to do this yourself, if it fails, that associate that you were trying to do a very good thing for them, all of a sudden becomes kind of a bad blood type thing, that he tried to buy in and you didn't want him to do this, or you didn't want her to do that. And now, it's very likely that they're going to now leave because, they tried to buy in and it didn't work out. So I love these. They're great. We have an article written on these, but don't take them lightly. It's go get help. Don't try this yourself.
Right. It's almost akin to a marriage, really, because you're getting a partner, right? And it's really a marriage. So it's important. The purchase agreement, it enables the associate to come in, but that partnership agreement, that's part and parcel of that transaction, that's really your prenuptial agreement with your associate. So to Chris's point, if it doesn't work out, you want to be able to take that partnership agreement, and you two already, or you two, or how many there are, you've already agreed to the roadmap to unwind the partnership ahead of time while you guys were on good terms and no one's looking to screw each other, right? Because what happens is, if bad blood results, somebody gets an attorney, and then you're arguing over a piece of equipment in the practice. You're arguing over this. It's just almost like, as anybody that's gone through a divorce or been part of a family member has, it becomes very difficult and very expensive. So you want to have that roadmap so you can look at it and say, okay, we're going to go our separate ways, or you're ready to exercise that second part of the partnership and you're going to buy an additional portion of the partnership. or you're going to buy the remaining part of the practice. It's all spelled out ahead of time while everybody's on good terms and everybody feels it's fair in a negotiation. I think we kind of touched on this, obviously on the outset, we've kind of overall, the most important time is between the letter of intent and the closing. And, I mentioned it earlier, I know Chris has, time. Once you think about the time involved, I think, Chris, you started out, as soon as you buy that practice, you start looking, right? Because there's so much time involved. Once you find that buyer, and you want to work on that letter of intent, make sure you guys are both focused on each other. You enter into that letter of intent, you take that and you start moving towards a closing. You just want to move. That's the critical time in there. You want to make sure you're working on the documents, you're sharing the information. Everybody's got a goal in mind to get all the parties to a closing at some point in time.
Yeah, and I think, we take a unique look at this whole process. And when I talk to sellers that we work for, I talk to them a lot about we represent the seller, but our job is to help the buyer through the process. So it sounds very odd, but we represent the seller and we represent their best interest, but it's the best interest of the seller for somebody to help the buyer through the process of, examining the financials, getting financing, looking at the documents, even though we're not representing the buyer, we're representing the seller, we have to help the buyer through this process, or somebody does. The problem is there aren't a lot of people, a lot of brokers and a lot of consultants that help buyers because, I always say they have no money. They owe a bunch of money already and they're about to borrow a bunch of money. So nobody really wants to help them.
Right.
But as a broker representing the seller, our job is to really kind of help that buyer through because it's in the seller's best interest to sell to them. So, you just got to do what you have to do. And, it's an arduous process. A lot of young veterinarians, as soon as they start through the process, the first thing they think of is, I'm getting out. I'm quitting. I can't do this. It's too much work. It's too crazy. Look at all these numbers. I don't have $1 million. I don't have 500,000. I don't have all this, and they get very afraid of the process because they should be. They've never done it before and we don't learn anything about it in school. So, again, you need people in your corner to really help these people through because, it's a scary process for, a young veterinarian to take on that sort of debt. So.
And it is a real time consuming process, Chris, and it kind of leads into the next and final slide, getting your professionals in place. Just in terms of when I'm on a transaction, as representing a seller, I'm working with Chris and his team. You can see how much more efficient the deal moves through the time of letter of intent and through the closing. They're on most of the calls that we're doing with buyer's counsel, right? And they're also doing their own weekly call, typically with the buyer, just the buyer and seller without the attorneys, working through the documents, getting the information from the seller over to buyer. What does the buyer's bank need? Facilitating. There's so much information that needs to get facilitated, and they're really behind the scenes helping gather all that information. And that helps the buyer out, and it's helping you as a seller because most of our selling clients, like I said earlier, are so darn busy. You guys are so darn busy. I have a call tomorrow with a client who's selling. He's working 12, 14-hour days. He's got a window like 11:30 to speak with me. You're trying to do a transaction with somebody. There's a lot on his plate in order to facilitate the information that's needed for a buyer. So when you're working with a group like Monarch, they're helping, like Chris said, not only you as a seller, but also the buyer, because there will be issues. We should do our best to work through the issues, and the attorneys do their best to work through it. But a lot of times, the attorneys, my job is not to make the decision for my client. My job is to negotiate the terms that my client wants. So if an issue comes up and for some reason I can't resolve it with the attorneys, I go back to my client. Maybe my client's, well, I'm not sure, I don't know. Chris, his team will come in and say, listen, let's talk about this. This is what we've seen in the past. We're going to go back to the buyer and we're going to negotiate this term. And it really, again, it's much more efficient and it keeps the deal moving forward.
Yeah, and I think, obviously Peter and I are selling each other, but it's important. We work together, but we both work with other, Peter works with other advisors, I work with other lawyers, but it's important to get a transaction attorney, not your cousin or your brother's wife or somebody that it's more important to get somebody who's familiar with transactions and business purchases. And I think it's even more important to get somebody who's familiar with the veterinary world, because there's inventory and equipment and employment agreements, and there's a lot of unique things in the veterinary world that are going to help the process go through. And what we want we want lawyers in both corners who are trying to get the deal completed. They're trying to get the deal done. They're trying to protect your interests for the important things that need to be protected, but they're not obstructionists and trying to, hold up the deal or have an ego where, they want to be the most important person in the room. It's not, and believe me, I've run into a lot of lawyers who just aren't familiar with
Right.
this sort of thing. And they want to do a good job for their client. And so they're not doing it maliciously, but they're trying to show off maybe and show what they know. And really what they should be doing is just trying to figure out how to get the deal, moving forward, because, the wrong lawyer in a deal will spoil the deal, because again, there's not a lot of patience. It takes a lot of time. And the more people you have in there trying to mess things up, it doesn't take much to send the deal, spinning off into eternity.
Some of my partners on my team here and the attorneys on my team here, we hate most lawyers that we deal with. It's great when you have a transactional lawyer on their side, because he or she knows what they asked for. We did a deal. I never forget. I closed a transaction for an associate who bought, just like we're talking about. She bought her boss's practice. It was in upstate New York. We closed that in 2021. The letter of intent, which should take like a week, 2 weeks to negotiate, took us like 2 months to negotiate, because we drafted a letter of intent that we used on many other transactions. Same, it's what we talked about here tonight. That attorney came back and he had changed almost every word in that letter of intent other than is and or not, for no other reason. Like, I don't like that. I don't like this. It was just, that was just set the tone for the whole transaction. It was just terrible. And my poor client, her and her boss got run through the ringer on this thing, and it took much longer than it needed to. And that could run the risk of blowing up the whole transaction, which nobody wants to do.
Yeah, and if you have a good lawyer on both sides and they're both familiar with the deal, they know the 10 things that need to be negotiated. They don't negotiate all the words in the contract. I mean, the purchase and sale contract, if you're not familiar with them, most of the ones I see are 45 pages. And if you're going to sit there and pull out every sentence in a 45-page document, you're going to close in 3 years. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
It's too much. And you're going to spend a lot more money. It's like, well, I got this lawyer, he's less expensive because he's my friend. Well,
Right.
Instead of, a certain amount of hours on the deal, he's going to have 2 or 3 times because he doesn't understand anything. He's not
Right.
reading through the thing. He's not reading through the document, looking for the important points. And as far as accountants go, the accountant, when we're involved with things, we want them to advise you on your tax consequences and your tax situation. That's, in my mind,
Right.
what the accountant's job is in this deal. And, as far as the financial terms and the negotiated financial terms, we would rather, unless the accountant is very, very familiar with the veterinary world, we would rather them, take a back seat and, worry more about what is the tax consequences of the things we're talking about. because, you know, the veterinary world, believe it or not, is a very odd, strange place. Well, we all know that, but in the financial world, most accountants look at the negotiated deals that we look at and they say, this is crazy, you know, this is way too much money to spend for a practice, or, you know, this is nuts. And you know, we know what the typical, you know, we if you have 30 deals in a year, you know how they compare to each other. Not you're trying to compare them to, you know, a company that's out of the industry. You know, they just don't compare properly. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think, Chris, we got two questions. I know just talking about fees and whatnot, and I don't know if they're directed at you or directed at me. I see you get paid at the end through proceeds of sale. What is the approximate fee that you charge? I know I can answer that on my end. We always talk with the client at the outset. We give them a budget, in range, depending on the terms of the deal. That's it's we always talk about that in terms of what the transaction is going to involve, so they can budget accordingly. And in terms of, do you get paid through the proceeds? Yeah, it's just we work out all types of different arrangements with our clients and how we get paid. That's just on our end. I don't know about if you want to address it on your end.
yeah, I mean, we get, when we represent a seller, our fee is going to be based on a percentage of the sale. And it really depends on, obviously, if we're talking about a $4 million sale or we're talking about a $300,000 sale. So, we're going to, the first thing we do is evaluation, which is a fee up front. And we're going to go in there and evaluate your practice and kind of give you all your options and analyze the market and analyze what we think your practice is worth. And then if you hire us to go sell your practice, we're going to base our fee, with looking at that valuation and figuring out what's the best way to structure that. We only get after that, we use that valuation towards a fee if we successfully sell your practice. But unfortunately for us, we only get paid if we sell your practice. So, if we do a lot of work for you and your practice doesn't sell, we don't get paid. So that's our roll of the dice. So it's in our best interest to go out and find you a buyer. But we never, we don't force people to sell. It's never, if you got an offer and you don't like it, you don't take it. So I think we're one of the few people that do that. And we do not get ever paid. If we're representing you as a seller, we don't get paid by the buyer, whether it's a corporate sale or a private sale. We would only take a fee from one side of the deal. That's we consider that unethical. Some people do it, but we're not that.
Again, we just got one other question too, Chris. Somebody who's maybe an associate in New Jersey looking to buy into a practice. What recommendations do you have on finding the right people to help me through this process? Well, I think whoever that is on there, they should contact one of us. Through our contact information, we can certainly put them in touch and kind of like what we've been talking here tonight. I mean, it would be you and I know, since we both can help her out with something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we represent buyers too. So, we're not just out there representing sellers. In fact, that's how I started my whole business, was representing buyers, because nobody ever represented them. So I own my own practice. I had my own job there for a while until my wife fired me. But I spent a lot of time helping associate buyers buy practices because they really were on their own and nobody was really out there helping them very much. And that's how I got started. And I did that for years. And I got to the point where it was difficult to find practices to buy. I had a bunch of buyers, but no practices to buy. So we started representing sellers, and it's been a good thing for us. But yeah, would be happy to help you or point you in the right direction. That's for sure.
Chris, just on that point, I see, do you help to locate buyers? That's exactly what you're just saying. I see it here. Do you help?
Yeah, that's our job. I mean, we do have one doctor practices for sale. That's we do sell them. They're a tough sell. I'm not going to lie. It depends on where they're located. Obviously there's always, hot geographic areas for selling practices because there's a lot more buyers than sellers. But even in the rural areas, there's always, you never know when you're going to find a buyer. So, yeah, we do represent solo practices. I think you have to be realistic about the values. There's a whole different way of financing those. The banks are, real iffy on solo practices because a lot of times they don't have a lot of profitability. But we have ways of trying to find, financing for them. And again, do we locate buyers? That's our job. If we're going to sell your practice, our job's to go out there and find buyers. And it's not a great job. It's hard to do, but it was a lot easier when there were conferences and we were at 10 conferences a year
Right.
talking to associate veterinarians. But now we're in our living room trying to talk to associate veterinarians. It's not as easy, but
Yeah.
we'll be back.
Yeah. I don't see any other questions here. So I think that's it. Does anybody else have any questions? I think we're all set. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're always available. I mean, send us an email, reach out. You have the our emails from the invite to the webinar, and
Yeah.
we appreciate you guys listening to us. So
Yeah. All right.
thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Chris. Good time. Good seeing you again. All right,
All
guys.
right.
Have a good night, everybody.
And our goal is to put this up on the website so that you can be available. So if you know people that missed it, or you want to, I don't know why you'd want to watch it again, but you can.
Come on. No, it's all good. All right, guys. Have a good night.
Good night.
Take care. All right. Bye-bye.